Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack and today I am bringing you this utterly bonkers Renault Avantime. I don't know, I've always called them Avantime, but I think French pronunciation would be Avantime. Although the name is an amalgamation of avant in French, which means forward, and time, the English word. So I don't know, it should probably be Avantime, but anyway, I digress. Why am I talking to you about this car today? It's not a sporty car, it's not the usual kind of thing that I do. It is because it is a quirky, really interesting car. Not only that, but the story of the Avantime brings in three factors which I think are really, really interesting. And that is a company that isn't really a car company, Formula One, and even the first mid-engine car, and lastly, bankruptcy. But before I tell you about that, we take it for a drive, let's have a quick walk around because the looks really are something that we need to discuss. So the owner has just told me the correct pronunciation is actually Avantime, which is a good thing. So let's have a quick look around because the looks are somewhat controversial. I think it looks great, but I think one of the best quotes that you can get from the lead designer of the Avantime was that as people walked around it, they wanted them to be more and more astonished. And I just love that, and I think we can say that they managed to hit the nail on the head with that one because it is quite an interesting design. So at the front here, you have these little scallops with the air intakes, which I think look great. The sort of the silver roof with the big panoramic roof, and then the body colour, those little scallops, and then you sort of go back and obviously you have these crazy massive doors. We'll have a look at those in a minute. And then the classic bum that the Megane had at the time as well. So a really quirky car, but I think one that on the whole, I think looks pretty good. We do have to talk about what the heck they thought they were doing, because it is it an SUV? No. Is it a coupe? No. Is it an off-roader? Not really. So what the heck was it? Well, it's a cross between a coupe and a people carrier, I'd say. It's only got 4 seats as well. So at first glance, you look at it and you think, okay, it's a kind of a fancy sort of people carrier, but then only has 2 doors, only has 4 seats. So a really crazy thing. Let's have a quick look at the doors as well, because the way these massive doors open up, they have a double hinge. There is a hinge here, but there's also an inner hinge there with this panel that moves. So the Avantime was launched in 2001, but perhaps the craziest thing about this is that this wasn't the only bonkers vehicle that Renault made at the time. At the same time, it launched another car called the Velsatis, which is equally crazy, to me not as appealing as this. But I'm going to tell you a bit more about it when we take it out for a drive. And at the same time, I'll tell you a bit more about the history of the company that made this, because it wasn't Renault. And it is a really fascinating story that brings us into how this bonkers thing came into being and how it eventually killed the company. This is the V6 version, so technically it has the same engine as the Clio V6. It is detuned though, and to be honest, in this application, I don't really think it's a bit pointless to have anything that has any poke whatsoever. Now, before I tell you a bit more about the car itself, let's look at a few facts. They were, I think, hoping to produce about 100,000 a year. They didn't. In total, they produced 8,000. At the same time as the Avantime came out, there was also the Velsatis, which is a really bizarre, it was supposed to be Renault's flagship, but again, it was much taller than that kind of car should be. So they look like, in a way, quite similar cars, although the Velsatis is much uglier. The Velsatis did sell more, I think in the end about 70,000, still not a huge success, but at least it didn't bankrupt Renault. Matra was the company that made this. Matra was not, I mentioned at the beginning 3 things. 1, it's a car company that wasn't really a car company. 2, Formula One mid-engined. And 3, bankruptcy. I'm going to take you through all that because it's really interesting. Matra was not primarily a car company. It was an engineering company that got into cars in the 1960s. It bought Bonnet, who made the very first ever mid-engine car, and Matra kept on making it, the D-Jet, they updated it. So technically it was the company that made the very first production, in inverted commas, mid-engined car. Not just that, but they also were in Formula One from, I think it was at 67 to 72, and in 69 they won the Formula One World Championship with Jackie Stewart. So some real illustrious, incredible history. Also incredible is they won Formula One and they managed to go through it unscathed without going bankrupt until they made the Avantime. How did that happen? So in the late 70s, Matra sold the car division off to Chrysler. At that time, they were making things like the Rancho, which is probably the most famous car produced by Matra that you will ever be aware of. Now, by 1980, Matra decided to buy back the company. Chrysler was in trouble, had to sell its assets to Peugeot, and Peugeot sold Matra back. They were, at that point, making the Renault Espace, or assembling the Renault Espace for Renault. So Renault decided that it was going to take that car back in-house, and Renault itself was going to produce it. Hold on, there's a bit of traffic here, so I need to know what I'm doing before... Thank you very much, chap. So Renault was going to take the Espace back in-house. And the Espace had been hugely successful. And as a nod, I think, to Matra, they sort of said, okay, well, look, we'll take the Espace back in-house, but we will let you make the Avantime. I think there were a couple of things that killed this car off and eventually killed off Matra. The first is that it was just completely off the wall bonkers. I love it. I think it's just fantastic. It's too big a car for me, but if I had a family or something, I would be getting something like this, really off the wall. I think they look great. I like the design touches. I like the whole ethos of it, but it is a confusing car. I mentioned earlier, it's really a four-seater. I know it has 5 seat belts, but you can see at the back there that it's not encouraging you to use that sort of central seat. It looks like an SUV in a family car, maybe a sharper SUV than normal, but it only has 2 doors. They're big doors, but they're only 2 doors. So what the heck was it? And you can say, well, later crossovers were really, really successful. Well, yes, but crossovers tended to be crossovers between sort of off-roaders and SUVs, not between a coupe and an SUV. It is really light and lovely in here, and you've got these fantastic sort of full sunroofs. They can be opened with one button. So that's a really great feel from it. The screen is miles away from you at the front there, but a bit of a baffling car. If you look at it in the cold light of day now, I don't think it's aged a bit. Put some bigger wheels on it, and it could be a car that's been just released. The interior is pretty nice. I read a road test from the time where they said that there was a problem with the interior because they used essentially an Espace layout which was already a bit dated, so they had those sort of orange displays. Now, I think they look a little bit retro and they quite suit it, and the interior is pretty nice. Another incredible fact is that it had Scottish leather. The owner of this car, Gavin, told me that he thinks that because it was made by Matra, in terms of the assembly and putting it together, production, I guess, it's actually probably better made than some of the other Renault products at the time. You have a little squeak and rattle here and there. It doesn't feel massively solid in that way, but the ride is very good, which helps. You've got this panoramic view of everything around you. It's quite an imposing car to drive. Now, I always do a pull when I do my road tests, so let's try with this. This has a 5-speed automatic gearbox. Now cruising at 90 miles an hour, foot to the floor. It's kick down. You know what? It's actually much more enthusiastic than I was expecting. I don't know if you call it fast, but it suddenly makes quite a nice noise. And it really did start moving. The gearbox was quite responsive, dropped down straight away. Steering is very light. There is very little feel coming through. And it's a tidy handler. It's not bad. It doesn't just completely wallow in the corners. I'm sure if you really started taking liberties, it would. But at brisk speeds, it's pretty good. Much better than I was expecting. It's quite poised. The suspension works really well. Wow, you know, the chassis on this is so much better than I thought it would be. Hey, it's no sports car. Overtaking a cyclist in a corner. So I think Renault Matra did a really good job with the suspension. It goes down the road much quicker than you think it should do. There's more grip than I was expecting. And yes, you don't have any sports car-like sensations, although it is, don't forget, it's supposed to be a coupe. But it handles better than many SUVs that I've driven. And it doesn't disgrace itself at all. What a great car! What a surprising hero! So the engine is so muted most of the time, but when you call on it and you put your foot down, it wakes up and it makes a really nice little V6 growl that does come through. One thing that isn't so great is the brakes. I saw earlier, as I was stopping for a car that was overtaking a cyclist on a bend, thank you for that, that the pedal is quite mushy. They don't feel that strong. I think they're fine in everyday driving, but if you're driving it a bit more spirited, they could do with a bit more power. So I guess if you're interested in quirky cars, if you're interested in a family car which is different to the norm, I would really heartily recommend this. I think the V6 engine, I don't know if it's really thirsty on fuel or not, might be one downside, but apart from that, it really works really well with this car. I think the petrol and the diesel engines, although they are very refined these, so there isn't much wind noise, there isn't much noise full stop, so even the diesels aren't too bad by all accounts. But the V6 I think is what you need in this quirky little beast. The Avantime, well, it's a surprising car, and I would say if such a thing is going to exist in the future, this has to be a classic. It's such a peculiar car, but in a really good way. In a way that sometimes the French manage to do. It always ends up damaging them, like the Citroen SMs, but the end result for us is interesting cars, which is something I really love. Thank you all so much for watching. I massively appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed, please do. It really helps the channel. If you have an interesting car that you want me to review, then please get in touch. Instagram is the best way. And I really look forward to seeing you for the next video.